What if the moment that changes your entire life doesn't come with thunder or applause, but with the quiet touch of a child's hand? Picture this: a wealthy man, dressed in a black suit that seems heavier than his own grief, stands frozen in front of a gravestone. His posture is stiff, his eyes hollow, as if every ounce of life has drained from him. For years, this cemetery in Massachusetts has been the only place where he allows himself to exist without pretense. No boardrooms, no headlines, no polished smiles, just silence, shadows, and the memory of a woman he once loved more than anything. And yet, on this day, something unexpected happens. A fragile little girl, no more than 8 years old, approaches him with the kind of courage only innocence carries. She doesn't speak, she doesn't ask, she simply holds his hand. Have you ever been through something so small, yet so powerful, that it shook the very ground beneath your heart? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you. This story isn't just about wealth or grief or the loneliness that can haunt even the richest homes in Boston. It's about something far deeper, the way love, long buried under bitterness, can rise again in the most unlikely places. His name is William. To the outside world, William is untouchable, a millionaire who built empires out of sheer determination. His name appears in magazines, his face is recognized in every corner of the financial world. People envy his cars, his glass mansion on the edge of town, his ability to command a room with nothing more than a glance. But here's the truth he never let anyone see. Behind all that glittering power lives a man who hasn't smiled in years. Emily. That was her name. The woman he believed was his forever. She wasn't dazzled by his fortune, nor impressed by his ambition. She saw the man behind the mask, and for a time she gave him something money could never buy: peace. But one winter evening, when life seemed too perfect to ever end, tragedy struck. A sudden illness, a cruel twist of fate, and just like that she was gone. The cemetery became William's second home, a place where he could whisper to the earth as though she might answer back. His heart. It became a tomb sealed shut with arrogance and silence. For years, he built walls around himself. Meetings became his battlefield, arrogance his armor, wealth his shield. He thought if he kept moving, if he kept stacking one success on top of another, maybe the pain would blur. But grief doesn't disappear with time. It hardens. And William hardened with it, until even his closest advisors whispered that the man who once believed in love had vanished. And then that day came. Standing by Emily's grave, lost in thoughts he never dared speak aloud, he felt it, the small, steady weight of a child's hand slipping into his own. Sophie. He didn't know her yet, didn't understand why she was there, or why her touch felt like sunlight breaking through. Storm clouds. She wasn't afraid of him. This man whose cold stare made adults shiver. She didn't care about the stories told in hushed tones about his arrogance. She simply saw a man alone and reached out with the purest gift she had: connection. What is it about innocence that pierces the thickest walls we build? Why is it that sometimes the smallest hands can awaken the heaviest hearts? Have you ever felt that when one simple gesture reminded you that you're still alive, still capable of feeling, no matter how much you've tried to bury it? Stay with me, because this is where William's story truly begins. And as we step deeper into his world, into the shadows of grief and the light of redemption, you'll see how a single moment in a cemetery changed everything. What happened next is something you won't forget. And maybe, as you hear William's story unfold, something in you stirs too. Maybe you've walked through your own kind of cemetery, not always made of stone and flowers, but of memories, losses, and the silence of what could have been. Have you ever felt that strange mix of emptiness and hope, when the world seems to whisper that life can still surprise you? If this touches something in you, I'd love to know. Leave a comment below. Share your own story, your thoughts, or even just a feeling this moment brought back to you. Because when you write it out, you're not only giving voice to your own heart, you're also helping build a space where others realize They're not alone in what they carry. And if you find meaning here, if these stories speak to you, hit the like button. It may seem like a small gesture, but it tells me this kind of content matters, and it helps this channel grow so more people who need to hear stories like this can find them. Most of all, if you want to keep walking with me through narratives that explore love, loss, redemption, and the fragile power of human connection, make sure you subscribe. That way, every time a new story is shared, you'll be here at the beginning, part of this growing circle of people who believe that even in pain, there's light. Stay close, because we're just getting started. William's journey is about to reveal truths that go far deeper than what we've seen so far. William was not born into wealth. In fact, his childhood in a working-class neighborhood of Boston was marked more by struggle than by comfort. His father was a mechanic who worked long nights to keep food on the table, and his mother took odd jobs just to make sure William and his two brothers never went to bed hungry. From an early age, he learned that life did not hand out gifts. It demanded effort, sacrifice, and resilience. That belief carved itself into him, shaping not just his mindset, but the decisions that would later build his empire. He often said to himself, "If I don't fight for it, no one will fight for me." And so, fight he did. By the time he reached his 20s, William had already begun to climb the invisible ladder that separates those who dream from those who execute. He studied finance at Boston University, often staying up through the night, not only mastering numbers but also studying the psychology of people. He believed money wasn't just about arithmetic. It was about understanding desires, fears, and the hidden truth behind every decision people made. That clarity gave him an edge, and it wasn't long before he was sitting at tables with investors twice his age, holding his own with a confidence that made them both wary and impressed. But even as he built himself into the kind of man the world notices, there was a hardness in him, a wall of ambition that left little room for warmth. Love, to William, was a distraction, an indulgence that could derail focus. That is, until Emily appeared. Emily was not part of his world of suits and skyscrapers. She was a schoolteacher in Cambridge, a woman with a laugh that could dissolve tension in seconds. William first saw her at a charity gala, a place he only attended to secure connections with donors. She stood near the back of the room, talking not about investments or portfolios, but about books for children, the kind of stories that shape imagination. There was no pretension in her voice, no performance to impress. She was real in a way he had almost forgotten people could be. At first, William tried to resist her. He was used to women who admired his sharp suits and expensive watches, who leaned into the aura of power he carried. But Emily didn't seem to notice any of that. She looked at him as if none of it mattered, as if what she was most interested in was the man behind the titles. That disarmed him. For the first time, he felt seen, not as a millionaire, not as a figure of authority, but as William, the boy who once fixed bikes with his father in a dim garage, who once dreamed of being more than just another face in Boston's crowded streets. Their relationship grew slowly, but with a depth that startled him. Emily taught him to pause, to breathe. She challenged the way he thought, not with arrogance, but with kindness that refused to bend. When he barked orders on the phone, she would laugh gently and say, "You don't have to conquer every battle, William. Sometimes the real victory is choosing peace." He would roll his eyes, but deep inside, her words chipped away at the stone fortress he had built around himself. He began to understand that love wasn't weakness. It was transformation. It was the one force that could make all the money, all the power, seem irrelevant. Emily had a way of filling silence with meaning, of turning ordinary moments into revelations. William, who had once believed the world was divided into winners and losers, began to see a hidden truth. That real success had nothing to do with the size of his bank account and everything to do with the size of his heart when he was with her. There were nights when he would lie beside her, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing and whisper confessions he would never share with anyone else. "Emily," he once said softly, "I spent so many years trying to prove myself, but when I'm with you, I don't feel the need to prove anything at all." She smiled in the dark and answered, "That's because you've already won what matters." For a man who had spent his life in constant pursuit, those words landed heavier than any deal he had ever signed. She had become his compass, guiding him not just toward what he wanted, but toward who he was meant to be. Their love felt unshakable. Friends would often remark that William seemed different with her, lighter, less consumed by the endless chase of wealth. His colleagues whispered that Emily was his anchor, the reason he didn't spiral into the same arrogance that destroyed so many others at the top. For the first time, William allowed himself to believe in forever. And then came the night that tore his world apart. It was supposed to be a simple evening. They had gone out to dinner at a small Italian restaurant near the Charles River, a place Emily loved because the owner treated everyone like family. On the walk back to their car, Emily felt dizzy. At first, William thought it was just fatigue, the result of a long week. But when she collapsed in his arms, his heart plummeted in a way he had never experienced. The hospital lights, the doctors rushing, the sterile smell of corridors, all of it blurred into a nightmare that refused to end. The diagnosis was cruel, an aggressive illness they hadn't seen coming. Within weeks, the woman who had been his light was fading before his eyes. William spent countless nights by her bedside, holding her hand, whispering promises he couldn't keep. "You're going to be fine," he told her once, his voice breaking. "We still have so much to do, Emily." She squeezed his hand, her eyes full of a truth he wasn't ready to face, and whispered back, "William, promise me you won't let love die with me." But when she took her last breath, something inside him shattered. He buried her with the weight of every dream they had shared, every moment that would never come. And from that day forward, his heart became a tomb. The mansion they had once filled with laughter turned into an echo chamber of silence. He avoided the rooms that still smelled of her perfume, avoided the books she had left by the bedside. To the outside world, he wore the mask of the powerful millionaire, sharper and colder than ever. But behind closed doors, he was a man drowning in bitterness, unable to forgive life for stealing what mattered most. The cemetery became his only refuge. He would stand for hours at her gravestone, motionless, as if waiting for the ground to give him answers. He told no one of the conversations he had with the wind, or of the nights he whispered into the cold air. Why her? Why not me? And it was in that place, in the shadows of marble angels and wilting flowers, that William's journey took a turn no one could have predicted. For while he believed his story had ended with Emily, life was quietly preparing to write a new chapter, one that would test not his wealth or his power, but his ability to feel again. It began with the simplest of gestures, almost too small to notice at first. A child's hand, fragile yet steady, slipping into his own as he stood by the grave he thought would hold him forever. The night Emily's heartbeat stopped, time fractured for William. The doctors spoke in careful, measured voices. Their words meant to soften the impact, but he barely heard them. He remembered only the sound of the machines slowing, the sterile hum of hospital lights, and the stillness that followed. He held her hand until it grew cold, whispering words that dissolved into the silence. "Don't leave me, Emily, please don't leave me." But she did, and with her departure, something inside him withered, a part of his humanity buried in the same earth where her body now rested. In the weeks that followed, William discovered that grief has no rhythm. Some mornings he woke with a start, reaching for the space beside him, only to find the bed empty, her pillow untouched. Other nights he drowned in whiskey, convinced that if he numbed his body enough, he could quiet the echo of her absence. But no matter what he tried, the cemetery called to him. It became his second home, a place where he stood motionless before her gravestone, lips moving but voice failing, as if words could dig through the soil and reach her. To the world outside, William was still the millionaire they admired and envied. He walked into boardrooms with tailored suits, spoke with authority that made investors lean in, and signed deals with the kind of precision that could turn markets. He smiled when cameras pointed at him, his jaw set like stone, his gestures smooth and calculated. But behind closed doors, the mask cracked. His mansion in Boston, once full of Emily's laughter, became a mausoleum. Did see paintings, the grand piano, the polished floors, everything was pristine, but it all felt hollow, like a stage without actors. He would sit alone in the living room, staring at the fireplace without lighting it, whispering to the silence, "Why her? Why not me?" It was during this time that William's personality shifted in ways even he couldn't control. Grief hardened into arrogance, a shield he wore to keep the world from probing too close. He built a fortress of wealth, convinced that the higher his walls, the less he would feel. When business partners disagreed with him, he snapped with cold finality. When employees failed to meet expectations, he humiliated them publicly, demanding perfection with no margin for error. Power became his armor, money his sword, arrogance his defense. "Feelings are weakness," he muttered once, while staring at his own reflection in the glass walls of his office. "And weakness has no place here." He believed it, or at least forced himself to. Yet deep inside, the hidden truth was that his cruelty wasn't born of strength, but of pain. Every sharp word, every cold decision was a desperate attempt to keep others from seeing how fragile he truly was. The transformation was striking. Friends who once knew him as a man, softened by Emily's presence, no longer recognized him. His younger brother, Mark, tried to reach out one night over dinner, saying, "Will, you've changed. You're not yourself." But William's response was cutting. "I am exactly who I need to be. Don't mistake survival for change." The conversation ended in silence, and Mark never brought it up again. The hidden cost of his choices spread quietly, like cracks in glass. Relationships thinned until they broke. His circle of trust grew smaller and smaller, until only money remained constant. Behind the scenes, he justified it as discipline, as the mindset required for someone at his level. But when the nights grew quiet, and he returned to the empty halls of his mansion, he knew the truth. He was running from the memory of love, because remembering hurt too much. He convinced himself that his life was better this way. Emotions complicated things. Vulnerability slowed progress. By burying himself in work, in power, in numbers, he could silence the part of his heart that still screamed for Emily. The cemetery visits were the only exception. There, he allowed the facade to slip, if only slightly. There, he would kneel in the grass, his hand brushing the carved letters of her name, and whisper, "I can't do this without you." Sometimes his voice trembled. Sometimes he said nothing at all. Yet even in the depth of grief, William never stopped moving forward financially. He expanded his empire, invested in bold projects, and used his influence to bend markets to his will. The world applauded his success, never realizing the price he had paid. For them, he was proof that resilience and ambition could overcome anything. For him, it was a prison disguised as achievement. He thought he had mastered the art of control, but the cracks in his armor widened over time. The arrogance that once protected him began to alienate those closest to him. Trusted advisors quit, citing his unpredictable temper. Long-time friends stopped calling, tired of his cold indifference. Still, William told himself it didn't matter. "They were never truly with me," he muttered after one particularly heated boardroom exchange. "People only stay when they want something. I'll give them nothing to want." But no matter how many layers of stone he added around his heart, the cemetery remained his undoing. Every visit was a confrontation with the truth he refused to face. He was still a man who loved, who grieved, who longed for the warmth of a hand that would never hold his again. And each time he left the gravesite, the silence followed him back, heavier than before. He built his days on transactions, decisions, and authority. He built his nights on loneliness and regret. It was a dangerous balance, one that seemed unshakable from the outside, but on the inside, William knew how fragile it all was. He could control money, markets, and people, but he could not control the emptiness. And it was in that emptiness, standing once more in the quiet cemetery as the Boston sky stretched grey above him, that something unexpected finally pierced his fortress. He felt the smallest pressure against his hand, hesitant at first, then steady. He looked down, startled, to find a fragile little girl beside him. Her eyes, clear and unafraid, lifted toward his with a kind of innocence he had long forgotten. She didn't speak. She didn't ask. She simply held on, as if reminding him of something he had buried too deep to remember. Her touch was not heavy, but its impact reverberated through every wall he had built. And for the first time in years, William's body trembled, not with rage, not with power, but with the memory of what it felt like to be human. Years slipped by with the consistency of a clock that never faltered, but for William, time had lost its meaning. He measured his life not in days or seasons, but in balance sheets, headlines, and acquisitions. The man who once sat quietly by Emily's side, tracing the edges of her laughter like a map back to his own humanity, had vanished into something harder. The world saw only the shell he created, a figure untouchable, armored in wealth and prestige. But the truth was buried deep inside, hidden behind layers of arrogance that grew thicker with every passing year. He became a master of appearances, the black Mercedes waiting at the curb, the private elevator leading to glass towers that bore his name, the designer suit stitched to perfection. All of it told a story of victory. When William walked into a room, conversations stalled. People adjusted their posture, their tone, their entire presence to align with his authority. He relished the control, but it wasn't the satisfaction of joy, it was the satisfaction of domination, the reassurance that no one could ever see how fragile he really was. There were days when newspapers praised him as a visionary, the kind of leader whose decisions shaped markets and shifted the future. Forbes listed him among the most influential men in the United States, hailing his sharp instincts and unmatched resilience. Yet when William saw his face printed across glossy pages, he felt nothing but hollowness. "They have no idea," he would mutter under his breath, tossing the magazine onto his desk. "They don't know what it costs to look this untouchable." Behind the scenes, the man who once craved connection now despised it. His mansion in Boston became less of a home and more of a vault, a place where emotions were locked away. The dining table that once hosted laughter between him and Emily now stood untouched, its surface gleaming from polish but starved of life. He would pour himself a glass of expensive wine, sit at one end of the long table, and let the silence remind him of everything he had lost. Sometimes, in the dim glow of the chandelier, he swore he could still hear Emily's voice echoing faintly, like a ghost refusing to leave. His relationship suffered under the weight of his transformation. Business partners respected him, but they no longer trusted him. Friends kept their distance, wary of the sharp edges that seemed to define his personality. Even family, the few he had left, grew cautious. His younger brother, Mark, once his closest confidant, avoided visiting. On one rare occasion, Mark tried to pierce through the facade. "Will," he said softly during a Christmas dinner, "all this money, all this power, what's the point if you're alone?" William's response was immediate, his tone sharp enough to cut through the air. "The point, Mark, is that I don't need anyone. Dependence is weakness, and I'm not weak." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument, and Mark left early, the door closing. Like the final note of a song, neither of them wanted to hear again. Arrogance had become William's armor, but arrogance is brittle. The more he relied on it, the more cracks appeared in places he refused to look. He believed emotions were a liability, so he trained himself to bury them. When employees spoke of their families, he dismissed them with a wave. When investors asked about his personal life, he redirected the conversation to numbers. He built his world on calculations, strategies, and the kind of mindset that demanded control over everything. Yet no matter how much he pretended, he couldn't escape the truth. Wealth had not filled the emptiness. It had only made it louder. At night, when the city lights shimmered outside his penthouse windows, he often stood with a drink in his hand, staring at his own reflection. He saw the sharp lines of success, but he also saw the emptiness in his eyes. "You wanted power," he whispered to himself once, almost mocking. "Well, here it is. All. The power in the world, and nothing to share it with." His words hung in the air like an accusation, and though he tried to shake them off, they followed him into every corner of his life. The hidden truth was this: William wasn't living. He was performing. Every decision, every headline, every towering achievement was part of a carefully constructed act designed to keep the world from discovering how much pain he carried. And in this performance, he lost more than friends or family. He lost himself. The man who once believed in the simple beauty of holding Emily's hand was now buried beneath layers of pride. But grief is not something that disappears. It lingers, reshaping itself into different forms. For William, it turned into bitterness. He carried it into boardrooms, into conversations, even into his own sleep. The people around him whispered about his temper, about how quickly he lashed out when things didn't go his way. They told stories of the way he cut employees down with a single sentence, leaving them shaken. To him, it was control. To them, it was cruelty. And yet, despite the empire he had built, William couldn't escape the quiet moments. Those were the worst, the moments when the noise of the world faded, when the applause stopped and he was left with nothing but silence. That was when Emily's absence screamed the loudest. He would sit in his study, surrounded by walls of books he never opened, staring at the empty chair across from him. His chest would tighten, and sometimes he whispered the words he never let anyone else hear. "I miss you, Emily. God, I miss you." The contrast between the man the world saw and the man he truly was had never been greater. On the surface, he was untouchable. Beneath, he was unraveling. The wealth he once thought would insulate him from pain had become a reminder of what he couldn't buy back. His cars, his properties, his endless investments. They were symbols of victory to everyone else. But to William, they were monuments to emptiness. It was this duality that defined him: power without peace, wealth without warmth, arrogance without joy. He had convinced himself that this was the only way forward, that to survive in a world that had taken everything, he had to become untouchable. But life has a way of exposing even the strongest masks. It was only a matter of time before William's carefully built walls met something stronger than arrogance, something he could neither predict nor control. And it came, not in the form of an enemy or a business rival, but in the simplest gesture. In a quiet cemetery, standing once again before the gravestone that anchored his grief, William felt the weight of a hand slip into his own. Small, fragile, unafraid. He turned, startled, and found himself looking into the eyes of a little girl. Her gaze held no judgment, no fear, only a quiet certainty. She said nothing, but her presence was enough to pierce through the years of silence. In that instant, something shifted inside him. The arrogance, the armor, the endless performance, all of it wavered against the innocence of her touch. And for the first time in a very long time, William's carefully controlled world began to tremble. The afternoon had the kind of quiet that doesn't merely surround you, it enters you. The sky over the cemetery stretched pale and open, the kind of late light Boston gets when the air is cool and the leaves trade their colors for something softer. William stood where he always did, shoes pressed into the damp ground, eyes on the letters of Emily's name, as if looking harder could force them to move. He didn't notice the footsteps at first. Grief has a way of narrowing your focus, until the world outside becomes background noise. But then he felt it, the smallest pressure, gentle and sure, the way a bird might land on a branch that's held its weight 1,000 times. A hand in his. He looked down, startled, expecting a caretaker or perhaps another mourner. Instead, he found a little girl with a blue knit hat pulled over her ears and a coat zipped almost to her chin. 8, maybe, brown hair escaping in wisps, freckles scattered like punctuation across her nose. She didn't fidget. She didn't smile too broadly or look away. She just held on, like she had decided something and decided it completely. There was a steadiness to her that didn't fit her size. For a moment, William's mind leaped to the defenses that had served him for years. Who is she? Where is her parent? What does she want? The old reflexes sparked, close the door, seal the vault, retreat to strategy, but the smallness of her fingers folded into his palm neutralized the calculation. It was impossible to think like a CEO when the world had just handed him something so human. He cleared his throat, voice low with disuse. You shouldn't be here by yourself. She tilted her head, unbothered by authority, money, or the kind of distance adults cultivate. I'm not by myself. She said simply, I'm with you. The words knocked something loose. He almost laughed from the shock of it, this child offering the one thing nobody else dared to offer him. Uncomplicated presence. Not pity, not curiosity, not the behind-the-scenes whispers he'd grown used to in boardrooms and fundraisers. Just presence. What's your name? He asked, softer this time. Sophie, she answered. What's yours? He hesitated. The world knew him as William Caldwell, the name etched in glass and marble, a brand polished to a mirror sheen, but here that felt like excess, armor, a costume. William, he said, just William. She nodded as if that settled something. Hi, just William. He should have let go. He should have done the adult thing. Found a parent, called security, reasserted the boundaries that kept his life safe and predictable. But nothing about this moment was predictable. And for once, he didn't want safe. The impact of her touch had already begun a slow transformation inside him. Subtle, but undeniable. It wasn't dramatic. It was more like a door opening somewhere down a hallway he'd forgotten existed. Why are you here, Sophie? He asked. She looked past him to the headstone, reading the name even though she probably couldn't fully grasp the meaning of dates and dashes. I visit my grandma, she said. She's over there by the maple tree with the little flag. I come on Sundays with my mum. But sometimes I come close to other people too, if they look like they need someone. His throat tightened. He didn't know how to answer that. Adults circled pain like wary animals. Children sometimes walked straight through it. Do I look like I need someone? Sophie didn't flinch. You look like someone who can't put something down. It wasn't accusation. It was observation, a hidden truth, spoken without ceremony, the kind that bypasses intellect and lands where the real decisions are made. He swallowed, hearing in her words an echo of Emily's gentleness. I'm not good at letting go, he admitted. The sentence felt strange in his mouth, as if he had borrowed it from a language he'd once spoken but hadn't used in years. She nodded again, thumb brushing his knuckle, a small, absent-minded motion that felt oddly protective. Me neither, sometimes, she said, but holding hands helps. It should have been ridiculous. A titan of finance taking emotional advice from an 8-year-old in a knit hat. Yet the line between appropriate and true felt irrelevant. William knew power, strategy, leverage. He knew how to navigate the quiet warfare of big deals and bigger egos. But this was a different kind of navigation, a journey without spreadsheets, a map drawn in feeling instead of ink. I come here for my wife, he said at last. Saying it out loud rippled through him, the way cold water shocks the system and brings you fully awake. Her name was Emily. Sophie lifted their joined hands a little, as if acknowledging the weight of that name. I'm sorry, she said. No dramatics, no promises. The simple acknowledgement of loss, which is all a good heart ever really offers. They stood like that for a while, the silence not empty but full, a kind of quiet that allowed room for breath. William felt his chest loosen by degrees, the way a locked door yields to patient pressure. The mindset that had kept him functional, feelings are weakness, money is safety, closeness is risk, quivered beneath the softness of a child's palm. He could almost see the divergence point of his life, the decisions stacked like glass panes that had made him untouchable, but had also made him alone. "Do you talk to her?" Sophie asked, glancing at the stone. He followed her eyes. "I try," he said. "Sometimes I say everything, and it feels like I said nothing. Sometimes I say nothing, and it feels like I said everything." Sophie breathed out, the kind of thoughtful exhale kids have when they are concentrating on something that matters. "I tell my grandma about my spelling tests," she said, "and when I mess up, I think she likes both." He almost smiled. "Emily liked both," he said, "the wins and the mess-ups." "Maybe you could tell her what you haven't told anyone," Sophie suggested, then shrugged, as if offering a possibility rather than a solution. "Sometimes the words get stuck if we save them for people who are still here." He hadn't expected a revelation in the shape of a quiet sentence, but there it was, a doorway he could step through or ignore. The Khadja choice felt simple and impossible all at once. He looked at the stone, and something in his posture changed, some micro-adjustment of spine and breath that would be invisible to a passing stranger, but meant everything to him. "Emily," he said, voice uneven, "I forgot how to be the man you knew." He closed his eyes, not to escape, but to see better. "I thought, if I built enough around me, the emptiness would stop echoing." The admission surprised him, a behind-the-scenes confession he had never made, even to himself. It didn't. Sophie's fingers pressed gently into his hand, a reminder that he was not sinking. He continued, almost under his breath. "I turned hardness into a habit. I made decisions I'm not proud of. I punished other people for a pain they didn't cause. I told myself it was survival." "Maybe it was," Sophie said quietly. For a while, he opened his eyes. There was no patronizing pity in her gaze, no fear of his shadow, just a calm acceptance that felt strangely like respect. He realized he was breathing differently, deeper, steadier, like his body had decided to trust before his mind had given permission. A breeze moved through the cemetery, lifting a few leaves from the grass, tugging gently at Sophie's hat. She giggled, and the sound snapped against William's sternness like a bright thread stitching fabric. For an instant, he saw the life he had stopped imagining. Conversation at a kitchen table, homework spread out next to coffee cups, weekends that weren't defined by flights and deals, but by bike rides and sticky fingers, and the messy, ordinary joy he and Emily used to wonder about in the quiet hours. "Where's your mum?" he asked, half a step closer to practicality. "Parking," Sophie said with certainty. "She tells me to walk slow so I can think about good things." She glanced at him. "You can walk slow too." He laughed then, a hoarse, surprised sound as if his body had forgotten the mechanics. "I don't remember how." "I can show you," Sophie replied. "You just choose it, like when you choose the big things, but smaller. Choice." The word struck him with its simple power. For years, he had treated life as something that acted on him, forcing countermoves, demanding bigger shields. But choice had always been there, even in grief. He had simply made the kind that protected him from feeling. He had optimized for safety and called it strength. Now, a child was asking him to choose differently, not in grand gestures, but in small ones that make a different future possible. He looked back at Emily's name. "I don't know if I can be softer," he said, the truth clear and unadorned. Sophie considered, then answered with the kind of logic only a child dares. "You already are. You're holding my hand." The sentence landed like a quiet bell. No drama, just clarity. It reframed the entire moment not as a hypothetical transformation, but as one already in motion. Change, he realized, wasn't a speech or an epiphany on a mountaintop. It was a series of decisions made in small rooms, on ordinary afternoons, with witnesses who don't keep score. A woman's voice called from the path, warm and a little breathless. "Sophie!" Sophie squeezed his hand once more before turning. "That's my mom." She took a step, then paused, returning to look up at him. "You can come say hi if you want, or you can stay with Emily. Both are okay." He didn't want to move. He also didn't want to be left. The competing instincts collided, the old armor, clashing with the version of himself that had been slowly waking since Sophie arrived. He made a decision, not grand or theatrical, but deliberate. He crouched slightly to meet Sophie's eyes and said, "I'll come with you." They walked the narrow path under the maple, where late leaves collected in soft piles. William matched Sophie's pace, discovering that walking slow required a kind of courage he hadn't exercised in years. The woman waiting ahead, mid-30s, a grocery store name tag still, clipped to her coat, watched them approach with a mix of curiosity and caution. "Sophie, sweetheart," she said gently, "you can't just wander off without telling me." Then her eyes lifted to William, recognition flickering. People in Boston knew his face, if only from billboards and financial news. She straightened, protective and polite at once. "Sir," Sophie addressed the concern before it grew, "this is just William. He's visiting his wife. I thought maybe he needed a hand." 100 versions of himself rose in William's mind. The aloof tycoon, the defensive stranger, the man who chooses the quickest exit. Instead, he extended his hand, not as a symbol of power but of ordinary respect. "I'm William," he said, feeling the simplicity of it. "Thank you for letting Sophie help me." The woman's features softened. "I'm Claire," she replied. "She has a habit of helping." Her gaze flicked to Sophie with a blend of affection and boundary. "Next time, tell me first." Sophie nodded, contrite, but unbothered. "Okay, Mom." Then she looked up at William. "Do you want to tell Emily about your day later? I can come by the maple." He hadn't planned to return beyond his usual ritual of standing and enduring, but this invitation made the ritual feel different, less like endurance, more like participation. "Maybe," he said. "I think I would like that." They spoke a little longer, small talk that didn't skim the surface so much as accept what the surface was. A mother and daughter visiting a grandmother, a widower visiting a wife, 3 lives intersecting not through transaction, but tenderness. When the conversation ended, Claire led Sophie back toward the car. Sophie let go of his hand only when their fingers had to separate. She waved once, certain they'd see each other again. He stood alone for a moment on the path, noticing the details he normally ignored. The crisp edges of the air, the muffled city hum beyond the cemetery gates, the way light filtered through the maple branches. In scattered patterns, he realized he had been living as if sunlight required permission to touch him. It didn't. He had simply stopped standing where it could. On the walk back to Emily's grave, his steps sounded different to him. Not lighter exactly, but less punished. He reached the stone and found his breath steady, his chest open enough to carry words he had never granted himself. "Emily," he said, "a little girl held my hand today." He waited, absorbing the strangeness of sharing something new with someone gone. "She reminded me I can still choose." He glanced at the path where Sophie had disappeared. "I don't know how to do this, but I think I want to try." He stayed until the air dipped colder, and the groundskeeper's cart hummed somewhere in the distance. When he finally turned to leave, he didn't feel cured or cleansed. He felt present. A subtle recalibration, a shift in the controls he had gripped too hard for too long. The arrogance that once guarded him felt suddenly heavy, like a coat that had outlived the season. He loosened it at the collar, not ready to take it off, but willing to feel air against his skin. The city met him beyond the gates with its usual insistence. Traffic, phones buzzing, messages queued like soldiers waiting for orders. His driver opened the door, and William paused, one foot on the curb, one still on the street, aware of the decision implied in the posture. He slid into the car, and before the door closed, looked back once at the cemetery. Path. The image that remained wasn't marble or loss. It was a knit hat and a small hand, a reminder that the future doesn't always announce itself with trumpets. Sometimes it arrives quietly, and you have to recognize it by feel. "Home, sir?" the driver asked. He considered the word. Home had been a museum to Emily, a place where sound was forbidden and joy discouraged. "Yes," he said finally. Then, after a beat that surprised them both. "But first, the florist on Beacon, white lilies." The driver nodded, and they pulled into the flow of the city. William watched the glass towers slide by like mirrors, reflecting a man he no longer fully recognized. He wasn't ready to name the change, but he could feel its outline. A transformation rarely announces itself. It builds in layers, subtle as a hand finding yours on a cold afternoon. That night, the mansion was still. He placed the lilies in a vase and set them on the piano Emily used to touch, just to hear the soft bloom of a single note. He stood there a long time, then pressed one key, quiet, almost hesitant, and let the sound float into the room. "I met someone today," he said into the dimness. "She showed me something I forgot I had." He didn't specify hope. He didn't have to. The air seemed to understand. He slept lightly, waking once before dawn with the sensation of that small hand still threaded through his. It was a feeling, not a memory, and it guided his morning decisions with unexpected gentleness. Coffee, but not the rushing kind. A walk on the balcony before emails, a message unsent instead of delivered in anger. None of it fixed anything monumental, all of it changed something anyway. By noon, the headlines had resumed their theatre. Markets up, rumors of a merger, analysts passing his past moves for signs of future decisions. He read none of it. Instead, he opened a drawer and pulled out a photo of Emily by the river, hair caught in the wind, eyes lit with that patient mischief that had always pulled him toward the better version of himself. He placed the photo on his desk where reports normally went and let it alter the room's gravity. He didn't declare resolutions. He didn't construct a plan. He simply listened for the part of him that had not spoken in years and found it had a voice again. Somewhere inside, the stone shifted, making space for something softer to take root. The day moved forward, ordinary as any other, and yet charged with a quiet difference, like the first mile of a long road. You never intended to walk until someone kind showed you where it began. The warmth didn't rush in all at once. It seeped through like sunlight finding a gap in heavy curtains. William felt it first in his palm, where Sophie's small hand had rested, then in his chest, where something long frozen loosened without asking permission. It was not dramatic, not a miracle with trumpets. It was a shift, quiet, clean, undeniable. He had spent years insisting that feelings were a liability, that to survive, you must harden. Yet as he replayed the simple pressure of those fingers, he recognized a hidden truth he had refused to admit. Hardness had not kept him safe. It had kept him separate, and separation, dressed up as strength, had cost him the only thing he couldn't buy, the ability to feel the world and be changed by it. That afternoon became a hinge in his memory, the kind of behind-the-scenes turning point you only recognize when you look back and realize the trajectory bent there. He went home and found himself moving more slowly, noticing edges of things, how the late light lay across the piano lid, how the house sighed when the front door closed, how the lilies on the table tilted as if listening. It wasn't that grief disappeared. It didn't. Grief stayed, faithful as a shadow. But it stopped dictating every decision. The mindset he had protected for so long, the one that believed control and distance were the only way forward, met a counterweight in innocence. Innocence didn't argue. It simply made room. He kept thinking of Emily's hand in the early mornings, the way she squeezed his fingers when crossing streets, even though he was the one guiding her. That was what the small hand had felt like, someone remembering him back into himself. He wasn't ready for declarations. He was ready to breathe without bracing. He poured coffee and stood at the window, tasting the day. He answered fewer emails with fire. He reread messages before sending them, catching the cruelty he used to. Justify as clarity. He didn't announce a transformation. He allowed one to begin. The next Sunday, the cemetery opened its quiet again, and William returned with a bouquet, not out of obligation, but invitation. He walked past familiar names to the maple where Sophie had mentioned her grandmother. He paused there, not to intrude, but to acknowledge. Morning, he said to the tree, to the air, to whatever listens when we say that word to the past. Then he continued to Emily's stone and placed the flowers gently, as if placing them changed something in the soil. In a way, it did. It changed him. He spoke in low tones that carried only as far as they needed. "I don't have the right words," he admitted. "I have the right feeling, though. I think you would recognize it." He stopped, smiled at the ground. "A girl held my hand. I felt alive, Em." Saying it brought a small surge of heat to his cheeks. He realized it had been years since embarrassment had visited him. Arrogance doesn't blush. The warmth felt new and good. There was a small sound behind him, the soft scuff of a sneaker. He turned and found Sophie standing a few yards away, hands tucked into the sleeves of a hoodie that read, "Boston Public" in faded letters. She didn't run up. She waited until his gaze settled, then approached with that same unhurried composure. "Hi," she said. He nodded. "Hi, Sophie." She looked at the flowers, at the stone, at his face. "You came back." "I did." He surprised himself with the next line. "I wanted to." Sophie brightened without becoming loud. Kids who spend time in quiet places learn to celebrate without breaking the atmosphere. "My mom brought muffins," she whispered, as if sharing a secret. "Blueberry. I can give you one if you like blueberries." "I do," he said, then added, because truth belonged here, "I like them more today than I did yesterday." They ate near the maple, muffins split on napkins, crumbs dotted across grass. Claire joined them, offering a gentle smile, not prying into what she didn't need to know. The conversation stayed simple. School projects, the chill of late fall, the way the city sounded different on Sundays. When Claire stepped back to take a phone call, Sophie leaned close. "Did you tell Emily about your day?" "I did," he answered. "I told her about white lilies and blueberry muffins and a girl who thinks walking slow is a kind of skill." Sophie nodded gravely. "It is." He laughed, then grew thoughtful. "When you held my hand, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, warmth where there was only quiet. Like when you put your hands in warm water after being outside in the snow. Exactly like that." He looked at the stone again. "Do you ever feel like talking isn't the point? Like someone knowing you're there is enough?" "Most of the time," she said. "Some things don't want words. They want company." There it was, purity breaking through pain without the need for explanation. He had read 1,000 leadership books, pitched 100 strategies, diagrammed entire markets on whiteboards that stretched wall to wall. None of it had taught him this. That presence was an answer of its own. The impact of that realization didn't come as a revelation with fireworks. It arrived like breath-filling lungs that had been practicing how to hold air again. In the days that followed, small decisions began to carry disproportionate weight, not because they were dramatic, but because they implied a different allegiance. He stopped CCing 3 extra people on emails meant to intimidate. He asked his assistant to bring him the notes from a foundation meeting he had ignored, programs for literacy, after-school tutoring, a community arts center in Dorchester that needed funding for instruments. Years ago, Emily had talked about initiatives like that with animation. "Music changes the room," she'd said. "Sometimes a note rearranges the dust in your heart." He had shrugged then. Now he read every line twice. He called. "Mark." The phone rang longer than it used to. When his brother answered, William heard the distance, but also the thread that could still be tugged. "Hey," he said. "I figure I owe you a dinner. With real listening this time." Mark's pause had shape. "You okay?" "I'm not sure," William replied, "but I think I'm pointed better." "Okay," Mark said, cautious, easing into hope. "Let's try it." On a Tuesday, he walked past his own reflection 5 times and didn't check his tie once. He noticed the janitor's cart in the hallway and said, "Good morning, Arthur," because he had finally asked the man's name. The older man blinked at him, then smiled in a way that put decades into the curve of his cheeks. "Morning, Mr. Caldwell." William felt the greeting land like a pebble in a pond, rings moving outward into places he would never map. He didn't surrender his edge, he recalibrated it. When a deal meeting grew tense, the old instinct to dominate lit up like a switchboard. He let the current pass and didn't flip it. "Walk me through your concern," he said to a junior partner whose ideas he would have bulldozed a month ago. The young man explained, voice steadying as he realized he was actually being heard. They adjusted the model. The numbers improved. Power, William discovered, didn't diminish when shared, it clarified. The outcome impressed the board, but the real victory was internal. A mindset shift so subtle it barely left a mark, and yet it altered the entire line of travel. At night, loneliness still came. He didn't pretend otherwise, but it no longer arrived as a verdict. It arrived as a weather pattern, observed, endured, not mistaken for identity. He kept the lilies fresh. He left the piano lid open. He kept one photo of Emily on the desk and one on the nightstand, not to suffer, but to remember the texture of love without embalming it. He also started walking, not the treadmill kind, sidewalks, the river, the quiet streets that tuck themselves behind the avenues, where shop signs whisper lime green open in the afternoons. He saw things he had not allowed himself to see. A father teaching a daughter to tie a scarf, the concentration on her face, the patience in his hands. An old couple arguing about tomatoes with a tenderness that made the argument irrelevant. A teenage boy holding a door with performative nonchalance that didn't hide his pride. These ordinary scenes did something Emily's absence had prevented for too long. They reintroduced him to the human city he lived in. On a Thursday, he found himself outside a small music store with a handwritten sign about donating instruments for kids. He went in, the bell over the door chiming a nervous little joke, and left with a list of what the Dorchester Center needed. "This is just a start," he told the owner, "but I'd like to fund the rest anonymously." The owner nodded, eyes dampening, no speech prepared for that kind of decision. William left before gratitude could stick to him like a title. He didn't want titles, he wanted movement. The next Sunday returned them to the maple and the gravestone. Sophie showed him a drawing, 3 figures holding hands under a tree. She labeled them with appreciation for clarity. Me, Mom, just William. He laughed when he saw it, the kind of laugh that carries a piece of clean air into the next minute. "May I keep it?" he asked. "Of course," she said. "You're in it." He folded the paper carefully, placed it inside his jacket like a contract written by a kinder future. Claire thanked him for the lilies he'd left at her mother's stone. Anonymous, he thought, but kindness keeps a signature that people learn to recognize without seeing the name. "You didn't have to," she said quietly. "I wanted to," he answered. Again, the simplicity. It was becoming a habit. Later, he and Sophie stood at Emily's grave and didn't fill the air with attempts to tidy what can't be made neat. He learned the difference between silence that isolates and silence that gathers. One pushes you to the cold edge, the other draws you closer to the middle of something warm. He had lived at the edge for too long. The small hand pulled him inward. "Do you think she knows?" Sophie asked, eyes on the stone. "I think love knows more than we do," he said. "What do you tell her now?" He took a breath and let the answer arrive without forcing it. "That I'm learning to live with the door open." Sophie nodded, as if this met a standard set by angels. "That's hard," she said. "It is," he agreed. "It's easier when someone stands in the doorway with you." The wind moved through the branches and carried a faint chime from a distant yard, someone's porch decoration talking in soft syllables. He thought of how much he had missed by insisting that life speak loudly. He thought of decisions made from fear that had masqueraded as confidence. He thought of the revelation embodied by a child who had walked straight into his grief and called it by its right name without ever saying the word. The impact of that truth didn't end here. It began here. On his desk, the drawing found a frame. On his calendar, a new block appeared once a week at the same time, no title, no attendees. He kept the appointment with himself and the city. Some weeks, he stopped by the Dorchester Centre to hear kids try trumpets and violins, the courageous squeaks that make adults wince but make hope grin. Other weeks, he returned to the cemetery and learned how to stand without bracing. When hard. Days returned, and they did. He didn't punish the softness. He reminded himself that the journey wasn't a straight line. He let small rituals anchor him. Lilies on Saturdays, piano on Sundays, coffee without the shield of a phone in the morning. He found that grief respected routines that honored love. He found that arrogance suffocated in rooms where gentleness set the air. At a meeting in late afternoon, an old rival made a barbed comment about William's recent philanthropic detours, a phrase dipped in contempt. The old William would have lashed. This William felt the barbs fall to the floor. "Returns aren't always measured in quarters," he said calmly. "Some take a generation." The room quieted. No one argued, not because they all agreed, but because the certainty in his tone no longer came from performance. It came from alignment. He didn't erase who he was. He integrated what he had learned. He still liked a sharp suit and a precise schedule. He still demanded excellence, but excellence expanded to include kindness where it had once excluded it. Leadership was redefined without a memo. First for himself, then for those who watched, and slowly mirrored. The invisible ledger he kept for years began to show different profit, moments of connection that paid dividends in meaning. And when Sunday arrived again, he found himself early at the cemetery, standing where light fell in patches between the maple leaves. He traced Emily's name, feeling the familiar ache without, asking it to leave. A small engine hummed on the road beyond the gates, shoes scuffed on gravel. His body knew the rhythm before his mind did. He didn't turn right away. He let the moment form the way a photograph develops in a tray, shapes appearing, contrast rising, details declaring themselves. Then he looked up, ready to meet whatever came next, with the door a little wider than before. William had always been good at compartmentalizing. It was a skill he honed from childhood when his father came home exhausted and irritable, when money was short and the house felt too small to contain the weight of silence. He learned early how to push feelings into boxes, to tighten the lid and keep moving. That same mindset had built his empire, had allowed him to survive loss, had turned him into a figure others couldn't touch. But Sophie's hand had slipped through the cracks of that system like water seeping into stone. And water, over time, reshapes everything. In the days that followed, he told himself it was nothing. A kind gesture from a child, a fleeting interaction that shouldn't matter. He had dinners to attend, contracts to review, headlines to maintain. Life at his level didn't pause for sentiment. Yet he found himself replaying it. How small her hand had been, how steady, how her words had cut through years of silence with the simplicity of truth. "You look like someone who can't put something down." It echoed at odd times, during board meetings while his driver wove, through city streets, even in the rare moments he sat alone by the fire with a glass of bourbon. He had faced billion-dollar decisions with less weight than that single observation. At first, he resisted by retreating further into the role he knew best. He raised his voice more sharply in meetings, cut people off mid-sentence, doubled down on arrogance as if sheer force could drown the memory. "Feelings don't build towers," he reminded himself. "Discipline does." But the reminders rang hollow. The towers were already built, and inside them he was still alone. One evening, he stood in front of a floor-to-ceiling window in his penthouse. The city stretched below him like a board game he could manipulate at will. He pressed his palm against the glass, imagining Sophie's hand against his instead. The contrast made his chest ache. He whispered into the reflection, half bitter, half bewildered, "Why can't I shake this?" The answer, unspoken but undeniable, was that he didn't want to. For the first time in years, he had felt something not tied to power, not bought or performed, but given freely. Innocence had no agenda, and its impact was more profound than all the strategies he'd built around himself. He fought it by clinging to routine, Wake early, review reports, sign contracts, outperform. Yet small cracks appeared where arrogance once held firm. He noticed the janitor again, not as a fixture of the building, but as a man with tired eyes. He found himself saying, "How are you?" "Tonight?" Before he could stop, the janitor, startled, answered with genuine warmth, and the exchange lingered in William's mind long after. That night, he sat at his desk, staring at Emily's photo. He wanted to speak to it, but the words tangled. Finally, he said softly, "Someone reminded me I can still feel." His own voice startled him. He hadn't admitted vulnerability aloud in years, not even to himself. The confession hung in the air, fragile but alive. The inner battle grew sharper. Part of him wanted to dismiss Sophie as an anomaly, a fleeting interruption in a carefully curated existence. The other part couldn't deny the subtle transformation already underway. His arrogance had always served as armor, but armor is heavy. Carry it long enough, and you forget what it feels like to move freely. With every memory of that hand, he felt the weight differently, not as safety, but as burden. The mindset that had once saved him now revealed its hidden cost. He realized how much energy went into keeping walls intact. How many decisions he had made, not from strength but from fear, disguised as authority. Behind the scenes of his success, bitterness had been the engine, not brilliance. Sophie had shown him that with nothing more than presence. Still, he resisted. Change, even when it whispers of freedom, feels like threat to a man who has built his identity on control. At dinner with colleagues, he laughed louder than necessary, tried to project certainty. But when one of them raised a toast to the man who has everything, the words stung instead of soothed. Everything, he thought, everything but the one thing that matters. He lowered his glass before finishing the sip. Late one night, he returned to the cemetery alone, as he often did. The city was quiet, the air crisp. He stood at Emily's grave, fingers grazing the carved letters, and let himself admit what he had avoided. "I thought love died with you," he whispered. "But I was wrong, wasn't I?" The wind stirred, as if entering. He let his hand fall to his side, half expecting Sophie's small grip to find it again. When it didn't, he realized how much he wanted it to. The battle inside him wasn't a single clash. It was a series of moments, decisions, tiny revelations that chipped away at his defenses. He found himself walking slower on sidewalks, noticing faces instead of rushing past them. He listened longer when people spoke, even if he didn't agree. He started carrying Emily's picture in his briefcase, not to hide it in a drawer, but to remind himself of who he had once been capable of being. Arrogance still flared. Old habits don't vanish overnight. There were days when his temper snapped, when he cut off a subordinate with cruel precision. But afterward, instead of feeling victorious, he felt hollow. He heard Sophie's voice in his head. "You look like someone who can't put something down." Each time, the words pressed harder against the walls he had built, and each time, another crack appeared. It was uncomfortable, even terrifying, to admit how much of his identity had been built on running, from grief, from tenderness, from love. He remembered Emily's last request, "Promise me you won't let love die with me." At the time, he thought it impossible, but now he wondered if Sophie's hand had been the answer to that promise, delivered years late, but no less true. One morning, as dawn bled into the Boston skyline, William stood on his balcony, coffee cooling in his hand. He thought about the empire beneath him, the towers and investments that bore his name. They looked solid, permanent, but he knew better. Even glass shatters under the right pressure. He had spent years pretending those towers made him invincible, when in reality they were distractions from the ruins inside. For the first time, he considered that real strength might come from letting the walls fall. He spoke aloud to the empty balcony, voice steady but quiet. "I don't know how to do this, but I don't want to. Keep running. The admission didn't solve everything, but it changed something. Like a chessboard mid-game, the pieces had shifted. He no longer played only for survival. He played for possibility. And possibility is a dangerous thing to a man who has lived only in certainty. It means you might lose control, but it also means you might finally live. When he returned to the cemetery the following Sunday, he wasn't sure what he was hoping for. Yet when he saw Sophie by the maple, waving with a grin that didn't need explanation, he felt something settle inside him. He wasn't ready for redemption, not yet, but he was ready to stop resisting. The walls he had built were still standing, but they no longer felt unbreakable. They felt like structures waiting for a decision, and decisions, he knew, were his specialty. The difference now was that he had discovered a new kind of decision. The kind that wasn't about profit or survival, but about choosing to feel. And as he walked towards Sophie, the ground beneath him no longer felt like stone. It felt like soil that could grow something again, if only he dared to plant. William hadn't realized how much of his life had been constructed around transactions until Sophie reminded him what existed outside of them. Every detail of his world, every decision, had been measured in terms of cost and return, in leverage and outcome. Even when he had been with Emily, though love had softened him, he sometimes slipped into calculations. What dinners should look like, what vacations meant in terms of appearances, how to control the narrative so that nothing fragile could ever threaten his image. Emily had always challenged him on that. She'd smile, shake her head and say, "Love isn't a deal, William. It doesn't need numbers, it doesn't ask for conditions. It just gives, and either you let it change you, or you miss it." He used to respond with a half-smile, pretending to agree, but secretly believing love still required management. And yet, here was Sophie, proving Emily right with nothing more than her presence. One afternoon, when the November chill carried a sharper edge, he found himself back at the cemetery, this time not by habit, but by choice. Sophie was already there, crouched near her grandmother's grave, tucking a small paper crane into the soil as though folding hope into the ground itself. When she noticed William, she stood and walked over, her boots crunching against the gravel. She slipped her hand into his. Again, as naturally as if she had been doing it her whole life. There was no hesitation, no expectation, just the quiet certainty that connection was enough. "You always bring flowers," she said, nodding at the lilies he carried. "Yes," he admitted. "Emily loved them. Do you bring them for her or for you?" The question startled him. He searched for the practiced answer, the kind that closed conversations before they became too real. But with Sophie, the rehearsed lines felt empty. "Maybe both," he said at last. "I think I bring them to remember her, and maybe I bring them to remind myself I still can." She nodded, satisfied, then skipped a stone along the pathway, watching it bounce and roll. "My grandma used to say flowers are love you can see, but she said the best kind of love is invisible." He felt the words strike deeper than she could possibly understand. "Invisible love," he repeated. Emily had tried to explain it in so many ways. The way she lingered beside him in silence, the way she never demanded he be more than what he was in the moment, the way she gave her kindness to strangers without worrying what they thought of her. He had admired it, even envied it, but he hadn't understood. Not until Sophie. What Sophie represented was not merely innocence, it was the truth stripped of all ornament. She didn't see his suits, his reputation, or the towers of wealth that bore his name. She saw only the man standing in front of her, carrying weight he couldn't put down, and instead of recoiling, she offered her hand. That was love without calculation, love given freely. For years he had convinced himself that such love was gone from his life, buried with Emily. But this child, who owed him nothing, proved otherwise. At home that evening he sat in his study, staring at the photograph of Emily. He could almost hear her voice in the room, not as a haunting, but as a reminder. "You always tried to make love harder than it needed to be," she once told him. gently tapping his forehead as though knocking sense into him. "But love doesn't bargain, William. It just shows up." He whispered into the air now. "I think I finally see what you meant." The confession carried no shame. It carried relief. The impact of Sophie's presence extended beyond the cemetery. In his dealings with people, he began to notice when he was defaulting to calculation. During a negotiation, he caught himself preparing to strike down an opposing argument with his usual arrogance, but instead of snapping, he paused, listening longer. He thought of Sophie's simple words. "Maybe you could tell her what you haven't told anyone." Listening became less about advantage and more about understanding. To his surprise, the deal not only went through but left both sides satisfied. It was the first time in years he walked away from a boardroom feeling something other than hollow triumph. He also began to see the hidden truth behind his own life. Love had not left him when Emily died. It had been waiting, patient and quiet, for him to lower his defenses. Emily had tried to teach him that love wasn't about wealth, status, or power. Those things were distractions, convenient illusions. Sophie's hand reminded him that love didn't measure. It gave, and in giving, it demanded only one decision: to receive. One night, as snow dusted the streets outside, William sat with the fire crackling in his study. He spoke aloud to Emily's picture, not as ritual, but as conversation. "You were right. Love doesn't need anything from me. It doesn't need my control, my defenses, my certainty. It only asked me to show up. Sophie showed me that. She didn't ask who I was, what I had, what I could give her. She just held my hand. And in that moment, she gave me more than I've let myself take in years." For a man who once believed his worth was measured in influence, the revelation was disarming, yet it was also liberating. The arrogance that had weighed on him now felt like a coat he could shrug off whenever he was ready. He was beginning to realize that love wasn't something you manage, it was something you surrender to. But surrender isn't easy for a man who has spent his life in control. The battle inside him wasn't over. There were days when he still snapped, when he retreated into silence, when the grief pressed against him so heavily that he wondered if anything had changed at all. Yet even then, he remembered Sophie's hand, steady in his, and Emily's, voice echoing through memory. "Promise me you won't let love die with me." And in that memory, in that promise, in that small hand holding his, William understood he had already begun keeping it. The cracks in his walls were no longer threats. They were openings. Openings that let the warmth in, openings that let him breathe again. He didn't know yet where the path would lead, but for the first time in years, he wanted to keep walking. The cemetery, once only a place of endings, had become the unlikely beginning of something else. Not a return to the past, but a continuation of the lesson Emily had always tried to teach him. Love does not vanish. It waits for recognition. And when a child reminded him of that truth, he discovered that even in grief, even in bitterness, love can still be received. The next step wasn't about rebuilding towers or reclaiming power. It was about something simpler, something Emily would have smiled at knowingly, choosing to let love exist without permission, choosing to live with the door open. And as William left the cemetery that evening, the snow settling into his coat and hair, he carried with him not the weight of loss, but the light of something rediscovered, something invisible and yet more real than anything he had built. The snow had begun to melt when William returned to the cemetery, but this time his steps didn't drag. He no longer came as a man defeated, collapsing under the weight of silence. He came as someone seeking dialogue, not just with the past, but with the future. The lilies in his hand were fresh, their white petals opening like small declarations of possibility. He placed them gently at Emily's stone and stood back, inhaling the crisp air. It felt different now, less suffocating, more like space being cleared for something new. "I used to come here to ask why," he said softly, his voice steady. "Now I think I'm here to say thank you." It wasn't rehearsed. The words rose naturally like water surfacing. After years underground, He touched the carved letters, then added, "You told me not to let love die with you. For a long time, I thought I had failed, but maybe love was just waiting for me to stop running." This quiet shift began to ripple into the rest of his life. The mansion still felt cavernous, but he no longer treated it like a vault. He opened the blinds, let sunlight stretch across the rooms that had been locked in shadows. He dusted off the piano, not because he could play. He couldn't, but because Emily had once said a piano should never be silent. He pressed keys at random, letting the uneven notes float into the air like proof that imperfection had its own kind of music. His redemption wasn't loud or grand. It showed itself in small decisions, each one a step toward choosing life again. At work, he surprised his board by redirecting part of their quarterly surplus into community initiatives, libraries, after-school programs, scholarships for children who reminded him of Sophie. "We're not weakening the business," he explained when questioned. "We're strengthening its meaning." For once, the room was silent, not from fear, but from respect. When he walked the city streets, he saw them differently. Before, he had viewed Boston as a chessboard, a place of strategy, movement, competition. Now he noticed its humanity. A woman balancing groceries and a toddler. A teenager helping an older man across the icy sidewalk. Even laughter spilling from a cafe window. These weren't distractions anymore. They were the very essence of what he had been missing. He caught himself smiling at strangers, a habit that felt awkward at first, but soon became as natural as breathing. Mark noticed the change, too. At their first dinner in years, William listened more than he spoke. "You're different," Mark said cautiously, searching for the hidden motive. "I'm trying," William admitted. "I don't know if I'll ever get it right, but I know I don't want to keep living like I've been." Mark leaned back, studying his brother with a mixture of suspicion and relief. "Emily would like this version of you." The words hit with quiet impact. William didn't argue. He just nodded, whispering inwardly, "She already told me through a little girl in a knit hat." Sundays remained sacred, but they were no longer cloaked in despair. He returned to the cemetery with lilies, but he also returned to Sophie and Claire, who welcomed him without pretense. They talked about ordinary things. School tests, grocery store shifts, the best places for muffins. And in that ordinariness, William found the extraordinary, the reminder that love didn't have to be dramatic to be real. Sophie sometimes slipped her hand into his again, and each time it affirmed what Emily had tried to teach him. Love wasn't armor. It wasn't leverage. It wasn't a contract signed in marble halls. It was presence. It was choosing to show up without conditions. He began using his wealth differently, not as a shield, but as a bridge. He funded instruments for the music center in Dorchester, but this time he attended the opening. He stood in the back, listening as children coaxed sound from trumpets and violins, their faces lighting up as though they were holding the world's secrets. A small boy played a note so sharp it made the crowd laugh, but William clapped the loudest, remembering Emily's words. "Music rearranges the dust in your heart." At the end of the event, a teacher approached him. "Mr. Caldwell, the kids don't know who you are, but I want to thank you. This changes everything for them." He shook his head. "They don't need to know me. Just let them play." Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "But thank you for reminding me that changing everything doesn't always mean changing the world. Sometimes it means changing the day." Behind the scenes of his public life, he felt a quiet transformation settling in. The arrogance he once carried like a weapon no longer felt necessary. It had kept him distant, but it had never kept him safe. What kept him safe now was something he had thought he lost forever: the willingness to let himself be touched by grief, by memory, by love, in unexpected forms. At night, the mansion no longer echoed with emptiness. He placed Sophie's drawing, the 3 figures under the maple, on his desk. Every time he looked at it, he was reminded that connection wasn't complicated. It was a choice, a decision repeated until it became who you were. One evening, as he closed his laptop and prepared to leave the office, his assistant hesitated in the doorway. "Sir," she said, "you've been different lately. Kinder. I just wanted to say, it's noticed." He smiled faintly, a genuine smile. "Thank you. I suppose I finally realized being feared isn't the same as being respected." On the drive home, he thought about the hidden truth he had ignored for so long, that life doesn't measure you by your wealth or your power, but by your impact on others. Sophie had reminded him of that with one simple act, and now he was learning to live it. When he returned to the cemetery the next Sunday, the air was warmer, carrying the scent of earth thawing after winter. He placed the lilies down and whispered, "Emily, I think I'm finally keeping my promise." He didn't expect an answer, but he felt something in the wind, something like approval. Sophie appeared a few moments later, skipping across the grass with a smile that could unravel the hardest day. She slipped her hand into his, and together they stood before the stone, not as man and child, not as widower and stranger, but as two people proving the same truth. Love doesn't need wealth, status, or power. It only needs to be chosen. And as William held her hand, steady and warm, he knew redemption wasn't a destination. It was a journey, one he had only just begun, but one he was finally willing to take. The path stretched ahead, uncertain but alive, and for the first time in years, he wanted to walk every step. The cemetery had once been a place William visited, only to bleed quietly, a ground where memory pressed down like a stone on his chest. But now, each visit felt less like punishment and more like pilgrimage. The rows of headstones no longer resembled a ledger of endings. They became markers of stories, each name carrying a universe of love, struggle, and unfinished sentences. He had come here for years looking for closure, but closure had never arrived. What came instead was something different, an opening. On that particular Sunday, the sun fell in long, gold strokes across the grass, touching even the darkest corners with warmth. Sophie was there before him, crouched by the maple tree, whispering something only her grandmother could hear. When she saw William, she waved, and he found himself waving back without hesitation, as if the gesture belonged to him. He carried the lilies as always, but this time the flowers didn't feel like an offering to loss. They felt like a conversation starter, a way of saying, "I remember, and I am still here, but I am also learning to live again." He placed the bouquet at Emily's grave and stayed silent for a long time. His hands rested on the stone, the cold surface grounding him. He remembered the early days of visiting, when every word he spoke was soaked in anger or despair. He remembered the nights when he begged for answers, when he screamed into the wind, when he promised he'd never let himself love again because the cost was too great. And yet here he was, with the memory of a child's hand reminding him that even the heaviest heart can still open. His voice broke the stillness, soft and steady, almost as if speaking to himself as much as to Emily. "I thought love died with you. But today, a child showed me it was only sleeping." The admission carried no shame. It was not a betrayal of grief, but a continuation of it, grief transformed into something that could breathe again. He closed his eyes and allowed the words to settle. For the first time, the cemetery didn't feel like a cage. It felt like soil where something could grow. He thought of Sophie's drawing of the three of them under the tree, of her steady gaze that had no fear of his shadows. He thought of Claire, who had welcomed him without agenda, offering him the rare gift of simplicity. And he thought of Emily, who had spent years trying to teach him the lesson he had only now begun to learn. Love isn't diminished by death. Love is a force that waits, that endures, that shows up in unexpected forms when you least believe in it. Behind the scenes of his carefully constructed life, a transformation had taken root. His wealth was no longer armor. It was becoming a bridge. His arrogance was no longer a mask. It was something he could lay down without feeling exposed. He understood now that the hidden truth of his journey wasn't about how much he had built, but about how much he had allowed himself to feel. And that truth, fragile and raw, was what Emily had always seen in him. He stood taller, not in pride, but in peace, the kind of peace that comes when resistance gives way to acceptance. Sophie came up beside him and slipped her hand into his without a word. They stood together, a man and a child, neither asking for anything, simply present. For William, that presence was the most valuable wealth he had ever received. The cemetery had become the very place he least expected to find rebirth. Among the graves, he found permission to live. Among the silence, he found the courage to listen, and in the smallest hand, he found the reminder that love does not die, it only waits to be awakened. As he lingered by the gravestone, the breeze moved gently through the trees, and for the first time in years, William smiled without forcing it. "You kept your promise, Em," he whispered, "even if it took me this long to see it." The air seemed to answer in kind, carrying the sound of Sophie's laughter as she pointed to a bird hopping clumsily near the path. It was a sound that belonged to the present, not the past, and William let it settle into him like a note of music he had forgotten. And that's why sometimes the smallest hands can awaken the heaviest hearts. If you want to see how another child changed a millionaire's fate, there's a story right here waiting for you. If you've stayed with me until now, maybe this story touched something in you the way Sophie's hand touched William's. If it did, let me know down in the comments. Just write, "I'm with you until the end," so I know you felt this journey alongside me. And if these kinds of stories mean something to you, a simple like on this video helps keep them alive and reaching more people who might need them. And of course, if you want to walk with me through more moments like this, stories about love, loss, and the quiet transformations that change everything, make sure you're subscribed. That way, you won't miss what's coming next. Speaking of next, there's a video right here that complements this one perfectly. Click it and let's continue together.